Hi guys, Matt Easton here. So I'm with Martin Austwick of the English Martial Arts Academy here. If you don't know his channel, I'll put a link below this video so you can subscribe to his channel as well as mine. You might see me pop up on his channel as well from time to time. So what we're going to look at now are some basic, first of all a basic attack in Sabre, but then we're going to look at how you actually open up someone to increase the odds for an attack landing. And then finally we're going to look at a way that you can kind of trick that system for attacking someone into, again, increasing the odds of you actually successfully hitting someone. So first up, if I ask Oz to stand in this guard position with the hand at the same height as the shoulder, there we go, and the point extended here. Okay, this is known as high second, or weights engaging guards, it's known in my club. This is a guard that was particularly popular throughout British military circles in cutlass and sabre. Right, so if I'm in the same guard, one way that I can launch an attack at Oz, as I've mentioned in a previous video, in order to reach him, I make it with a lunge step. Okay, so what I'm going to do is a cut number one, that is, just to show you from your angle, downwards diagonally, cut from the wrist so I don't open myself up as I make it, downwards diagonally from my outside towards their left temple. Okay, and what Oz is going to do very simply is move the sword over into prime, which is quite similar to what you'll notice in Oz's system of George Silver, similar-ish to True Garden, but with the point more extended in our case. Lift the sword over to parry the head. Okay, so I move in, I cut on the lunge. You'll notice the distance. If Oz just lowers his sword for a second, I'm cutting so that this portion of my blade would land. Okay, I'm not aiming to hit with the tip because the tip doesn't cut very well. Okay, the third quarter of the blade is what really cuts. So cut comes on here, I failed to land, and I immediately come back out again and retreat out in my high second. So we've looked at a simple attack with a cut number one on the lunge and a simple parry. I'll just reiterate that I come onto the cusp whereby I know with a lunge step I could lay that third quarter of my blade over the target. So the opponent is obliged in that tempo, in that time, to deal with that cut. Some of you might be saying, why doesn't he simply thrust me through the body? Well, in fact, he could, okay? But if he did that, it would be committing suicide. An unfortunate fact of swordsmanship is that if your opponent is willing to commit suicide, there is often very little you can do against them apart from shoot them or throw your sword at them. There are ways, in fact, if you notice beforehand that your opponent is suicidal, or just, should we say, not very careful, there are ways you can deal with them. And I'll mention that again at the end of the video. So, assuming he cares about preserving his life and his head, when I make the lunge step, boom, to here, he's obliged in that tempo during which I attacked to parry. Now, in the next tempo, he might attack me back, but at that point I'm moving out and closing my line again. So, this is a simple attack. All I've done is moved onto the cusp of distance, and I've made an attack. Remember, he doesn't know, in this situation, he knows I'm making a number one cut. However, in real life, in inverted commas, he doesn't know I might make a thrust underneath, or I might do a number five, or I might do a number four cut, or I might attack his legs. He doesn't know when I come into that distance and I start to lunge, he doesn't really know which attack I'm going to give, because all that he can see is that my hand is moving somewhere. Okay, in this case, he pretty much, at this point that I start to do this, he knows I'm not going to give point, or at least I'm not going to give point underneath the sword. I could, in fact, be giving point. If you look at the motion of the sword with the cut one, boom, to there, it's very similar to if I was to do that and thrust over the top of the sword. So his brain has a lot to process in that time to decide which parry or which guard he needs to put in to deal with the attack that's coming in. And he needs to read my body language to try and predict which attack is coming in, or even feel it in his blade in some situations, through blade contact, in order to put the correct guard or parry in. So we've been looking at simple attacks. As I've mentioned, Oz doesn't know which attack I'm going to put in if we're fighting for real. So even a simple attack stands a fairly good chance, if made correctly, of landing on the target. And you must remember that when you make a simple attack, it must be made as directly and quickly as possible. The first thing that should always move is your weapon and hand, okay? The main reason for that being that it's the quickest thing, okay? So you always move the quickest thing first and push the leg behind it, okay? Let the legs catch up, just as in George Silver's time of the hand, time of the feet, time of the body. The feet are always slightly slower than the hand. So you start to move the weapon, because you can actually do two movements in the time of one. You can do two hand movements in the time of one movement of the foot, in actual fact. So you always work to your maximum time that you have available, which is the speed of your weapon. So the correct way to make a simple attack land is to don't telegraph the movement at all. Don't give the person any clues what you're about to do. Make it as directly to the target as possible and as quickly. Never do something like this, pull the weapon back and make it obvious where you're directing the thing and then step in. Equally, never start to step and then swing with the sword, because at this point you've now, if we just show, if I step in before I make the attack, I've already stepped into the danger zone. It's very, very important that when you start to make the attack, they feel a threat that they have to deal with. That's what makes it safe to put the step in behind. Right, so what we're going to look at now is how to increase the chances of your attack landing by making it not a simple attack. That is using a feint. So, feints. What is a feint? A feint is not passing out and being brought to with sniffing salts, although it could be. In this case, a feint is a deception. So it's pretending to attack one place and then attacking somewhere else. So, for example, in the simple attack that we did, I did a simple number one to Oz's head. Say, for example, I did that motion with my sword without putting my foot in, and he starts to raise his sword up because he thinks a cut number one is coming at his head. What I now do is I commit my body, commit that lunge, actually with a number two at the sword arm. Okay, so this is an absolutely classic and simple and very popularly used feint. Feint, real attack. Feint, real attack. Okay? So it's very simply, and in terms of weight really breaks it down into simple terms, the feint is given with a motion of the sword, and the real attack is given with the lunge, on the lunge into distance. That means that if the person doesn't react to the feint, then you can just go back to where you were. You haven't committed your body into distance. There is no risk. And in actual fact, you can do double or triple feints. So I could feint one, and as he starts to move, feint two, and as he starts to move again, and then do a real number one. So you can string together feints and real attacks in different combinations and different numbers. And theoretically, you could go feint, 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 feint forever, and then a real attack after 50 feints. In reality, it's not usually done. The most number of feints that commonly happens in fencing, and according to Victorian sources, is 3 feints and then a real attack. In reality, the vast majority of attacks are either a simple attack or 1 feint and 1 real attack. Okay? So, that is one simple way that you can increase your odds of your attack landing, is to do a feint before you do the real attack. Something else to bear in mind is that a feint, if you feint every time with every motion, then eventually your opponent will read that quite naturally. They don't have to be brain of Britain to sort of read that this is a tactic you're using. And they'll start to not really react to the initial movement you do, because they'll recognise it's not a real threat. Now, you could, if you're really good and really clever, use that to your advantage. You could do a feint attack, feint attack, feint attack, and then of course launch a real attack. So you could in itself use that as a system for an ultimate feint that's just a simple attack. However, generally speaking, the general rule is don't open every motion with a feint and then a real attack, because then the feint loses its potency and loses its effectiveness. If you want a feint to work, the person has to be scared of the feint. So very simply, and again we'll use these same basic framework of attacks, a person is far more likely to react to the feint one, real cut two, if when you've led off or when you've started, you've done a real cut one at their head. Now, when I do a feint cut one, they're far more likely to react as if it's a real attack. So you try and mix up as randomly, as unpredictably as possible, the real attacks and the feint attacks. Last thing to say about feints is that feints can come in many different forms. We've been looking at the type that are normally spoken about in Victorian military sabre fencing. That is a motion of the sword before then doing a real attack somewhere else to whichever opening presents itself. However, you can feint in other ways, and I do know people who do this successfully, and they will feint by looking at one part. For example, looking at the legs and then attacking high, or vice versa, looking high and attacking at the legs while staying looking high. Equally, you can do it with what's known as a beat on the blade. So, a common attack from this guard is actually to thrust underneath. So if I actually apply a pressure to his blade, it's very likely he's going to feel a threat underneath, move his sword a long way to the side there, and open up the arm to a cut. So you can do it with pressure on the blade, with beats, with a motion of the sword, or indeed with parts of your body that aren't the sword. So, you know, a very slight movement of the shoulder, or a stamp with the foot, or looking somewhere with your eyes. So feints can take many forms.